Cool. All right. Well, thanks, Luke, for having me on your show. My name's Andreas Schmidt. I'm a professor of moral and political philosophy at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. I work at the philosophy faculty and the Center for Philosophy, Politics, and Economics. And I work on several issues in moral philosophy and mostly though in political philosophy. I've worked on issues of freedom, how to conceptualize freedom, how to measure it, how to let filter into normative judgments around institutions and policy. I've worked on consequentialism, a little bit on animal ethics, and I currently have a project on political philosophy for the very long-term future of humanity. So thinking about future generations and how that should or should not influence how we design institutions and choose public policy now. But I believe today we talk about something else, namely some of my work on egalitarianism. I've written on several issues to do with egalitarianism, think about egalitarianism across generations. I've thought a little bit about economic inequality and its different impacts across time, like the instrumental impacts, connecting that with economics. That's some of my other work. But in this paper, I think that we'll focus on today in particular, this is about relational egalitarianism, which is a view that has become a very popular view in the last sort of 20 years in discussions around inequality and the question of what, if anything, makes economic inequality and distributive inequality morally problematic. And maybe I'll start by giving a little bit of a history of the debate in political philosophy around inequality and how relational egalitarianism came in. Now, the idea of relational inequality, according to some people, goes back actually much longer. For example, in Marx, you already find some comments and ideas that some people think, foreshadow some of the things relational egalitarians currently are saying. But to situate a little bit the contemporary debate in analytical political philosophy, can always start with 1971 with John Rawls, The Theory of Justice, right? The most influential theory in political philosophy on distributive justice as well. And then in the 80s, Amartya Sen wrote a paper called Equality of What, right? It's a famous paper in political philosophy, which set off an important debate in the 80s around what should be the measure of justice. What is the kind of thing that we focus on when we think about how should things be distributed? And in my readings of the search for the so-called currency of egalitarian justice, try to achieve like two different things at the same time. So one, try to find a thing that we really care about when we care about distributive justice, right? So Rawls focused on primary social goods, such as income and some other things. And Amartya Sen says, well, actually, we also need to focus a little bit on what those goods do with individuals and the extent to which different individuals can transform goods into things that matter for their lives, for example, and then he argued for the capability approach, which of course has been very influential since. So it's kind of the search about what we think is really important. The other one is to think a little bit, okay, Rawls doesn't really talk about responsibility that much, right? So in the 70s, most people will know that Nozick wrote another famous book, right? Anarchy, State, and Utopia, and criticized that political philosophers often just look at kind of matrices or what you call patterns, right, of outcomes. Right? So, okay, this person is 10, this one is 5. That's very unjust, right? And Nozick famously saying, look, we totally ignore what happened before that matrix, Of course, he has his own theory, which is rather peculiar, but the intuitive thought is that the history before the matrix matters as well, right? And that most people do agree that issues, for example, are what choices did people make and to what extent can they be held responsible for that? That should also matter. So then so-called luck egalitarians in the equality of what debate try to find a sort of currency that captures both the thing that we care about, but also try to capture ideas around responsibility, right? And build that into a theory of egalitarian justice. So then people like Jerry Cohen and Ronald Dworkin, Richard Arneson, and several other authors, they then defended kind of views, for example, Arneson, equality of opportunity for welfare. So it's not like welfare outcomes that should be compared, but like the opportunity to achieve kind of welfare that should be equal across individuals. And so if people then make choices that are very stupid, or they just don't care about income that much and they just want to chill a bit on the beach or whatever, then that doesn't require a redistribution in the future. So, okay, that's sort of then with the goal to also introduce ideas around responsibilities of an idea of the economic right, as Jerry Cohen calls it, into egalitarian philosophy. Now, in the early 90s, so there's a book by Iris Marion Young, and then afterwards also the famous paper, What is the Point of Equality by Elizabeth Anderson. And that brought in really that relational egalitarian critique of that kind of whole research program. They say, look, what's really the point of caring so much about equality? It seems really we're just concerned with these abstract questions of who gets what or something. But then sometimes it doesn't fully track all the, well, the least you can say it doesn't track all the normative concerns and the central ones we have when we worry around inequality. In particular, the idea that what we care about is also the inequality that we find in actual social relations, right? So I think, just, okay, we capture, say gender inequalities and patriarchal societies by looking at who gets what a little bit, but also we really care is about these relations, for example, of domination that we have between men and women, questions of oppression and problematic hierarchies, and what all these things also do with individuals, right? And that's it's not really properly captured by a view that looks only at these sort of abstract distributive questions. And that, in a sense, then started that whole relational egalitarian research program. And to situate my paper now in that discourse, so we have, the luck egalitarians from the 80s and onwards, the relational egalitarian critique. And I always thought the relational egalitarian critique is somewhat convincing. But what I did find missing is what, intuitively makes luck egalitarianism rather plausible is the idea that we should also care about personal responsibility and the choices people make, right? So relational equality seems really important, right? That people, for example, are like dominated or subject to really crushing and stigmatizing hierarchies and so on. But at the same time, we think, well, this also seems a somewhat static ideal. What if people make ridiculous choices that are disrespectful to others and thereby lose some social, standing? That doesn't seem so problematic in the way that people lose social standing for reasons that are totally beyond their control, for example, right? So I have the example, for example, I have several examples that seem rather intuitive. So one called Money Burner. Petra receives a salary twice a year. Yet upon receiving a salary, Petra burns 90% of it, which leaves her destitute. You go like, well, Petra, that just seems like, why? It's a very different situation from someone who just has 10% of Petra's income for no fault of their own or something, right? And then, it's a bit of a silly example, but the point seems very obvious that at some point you go, well, Petra, that's your own fault. Stop burning your money, right? Or Tim works as a university lecturer, yet he only rarely shows up for class, does no research, and is nearly always unavailable. His colleague Jane, in contrast, performs all her professional obligations dutifully. Now, the point is to say, look, when Petra only has very little income, she will find herself on relational inequality to other people, right? Because she's just got rid of all her money, and now maybe, she can't afford nice things or can't afford a house or rent or something, right? And that will at some point lead to relational inequality. Tim, maybe, if we think he should get fired for his job, maybe he will lose social standing with his in-group, he will lose income and so on. So there will just be relational inequality as a result of their choices. So relational egalitarians need to basically say something why maybe that kind of relational inequality should be acceptable, right? And that's really then the niche that I go in and try to explain. Actually, here's an account of relational egalitarianism that includes concerns for personal responsibility. So not only does it sort of introduce them from outside, but actually a concern with relational inequality in itself implies that we should include concerns around personal responsibility in our theory.
Maybe at this point it's worth asking a little bit about, what the gulf really is between luck and relational egalitarians, because there's been obviously decades spent sort of building up luck egalitarian positions, and so it's like in Elizabeth Anderson's, is it the book, or is the point of equality a book or a paper? Because I'm thinking of where she wrote about the harshness objection, right? Where it's like you've got the guy who causes a car accident or whatever, and then you leave him to die because like that was his fault, right? And it's
Right.
like that's the idea is like she's the lucky egalitarians are getting something wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's from a paper. What's the point of equality? But to be honest, the paper's so long it could nearly be a book, right? So you're right in both ways. It's a very long paper. Um, yeah, so that's one of the objections that have been raised by Elizabeth Anderson, but also other people like Scheffler and Mark Flabé and so on, right? Yeah, someone has an accident that is their fault, and then they lie by the side of the road. You can say, well, look, your own fault, if you do silly stuff. Justice does not imply that we should help you. So that's one objection that you can make, whether you're relational egalitarian or anyone else, to luck egalitarianism. I should say that I don't think this is one of the objections, but maybe not the best, because luck egalitarians can say lots of things. One response is, when people take risks, for example, they do like some risky action that with a probability of 1 in 1,000 leads to some terrible outcome. And then, they get unlucky. 1 in 1,000, they do have a terrible outcome. Then lucky egalitarians say it doesn't necessarily imply that they should be held responsible for the entire badness, right? Compare someone who takes a risk of 1 in 1,000 to someone who takes a risk in 1 in 2 or something, right? And they both get unlucky. You think, the person takes a really risky choice, they should maybe cover more of maybe the additional healthcare expenses than the person who took like a not so risky choice, but also got unlucky. So that tempers a little bit the problem. And the other response, well, there's some more technical questions that you can respond to there. And the other response by people like Jerry Cohen is to say, yeah, it does seem implausible, but also we're not saying that this is the entire edifice of political philosophy, right? There might as well be other principles that we should concern ourselves with. Other people might say there's something like beneficence or Samaritan duties. He talks about like community, right? So the lucky egalitarians, this is like egalitarian distributive justice, which is one thing, but we still have maybe ideals of solidarity and community, and then that gives you enough reason to help people even when they make bad choices. So that's the hardness objection. But I think there are several other objections in that paper that are worth thinking about, right? For example, one is the idea that lucky egalitarianism, if you're responsible for your choice and that choice leads you to have less than others, then you should not be compensated for it. But it doesn't really look at the content of that kind of choice, right? So imagine I now have a relative who's very ill, and I decide to work much less in my very high-paying job. Sorry, not my own, but someone has a high-paying job. They decide to work less, and then they have less than other people, right? But they're doing this to support someone, right, that they love and care for, right? So, and then they become a carer for them. Now, compare that with a colleague of them who just actually, I just can't be bothered to work that much. I just want to surf or something, I'll just do nothing and just hang out and watch Netflix or something like that. And they find themselves in the same, income bracket afterwards. In both cases, they made a free choice, right? They maybe, let's assume, did those under conditions of response under which it's appropriate to hold them responsible. But it seems intuitively those are different kind of choices, right? One is really, a rather altruistic choice, and the other one is purely selfish or something. And she argues there doesn't seem much room within lucky egalitarianism to make a clear distinction between those. It's more like, how do you compare, in terms of what you have to others, and are you responsible for that choice? There's several other good ones. I mean, one is the sort of general complaint that just looking at matrices doesn't capture how people treat each other, right? You might think, like compare like different racial groups, and let's assume they have equal income, but they're just kind of like all these nasty stereotypes about one racial group, and maybe they're just always being belittled and something, right? So you can say, well, and that doesn't really affect maybe the opportunities for lots of things. But it does seem relevant, right? That there's some this unequal treatment and unequal regard. Now, lucky egalitarians can say, well, if you have a better measure of what you're distributing, you might capture that. But it seems, at least at first, prima facie, it's very hard to capture that purely through these sort of distributive concerns and matrices. Another big one that Joe Wolf and Elizabeth Anderson discussed is sort of the idea of intrusion, right? So if you wanted to use something like lucky egalitarianism to guide your decision on who gets what, you want to use that in public policy, then it really means you need to find out a lot about people, right? Did you really voluntarily get yourself into a position where you had less than others, or were there external extenuating circumstances? Say you, for example, struggle with some form of addiction or something, or you've taken some really bad decisions around your health. You want to say, well, maybe you did those kind of conditions where you had so much stress going on, mental health problems, or you were in social environments where this option seemed rather good, but you can't. There's a lot of complex questions to really distinguish the etiology, say, of this sort of behavior related health problems, right? That are very complex to find out, right? So if you actually wanted to make this work in practice, they argue it require quite some intrusive fact finding. Let me mention maybe a final one, which are quite, I think, is serious, right? Jerry Cohen also admits about his form of luck egalitarianism that it really gets you into the thicket of the free will problem and questions of moral responsibility and the metaphysics of moral responsibility, right? And that seems kind of a tricky question, right? We studied some philosophy. It's not that all philosophers agree that we've really cracked that one, and we have some easy criterion that we can hand to policymakers and political philosophers that we've now cracked the problem of exactly where to draw the line of responsibility. Of course, lots of people are saying, you shouldn't even, given causal determinism and so on, we shouldn't even hold people responsible in a thick sense ever, right? Does that then now mean we have no account of egalitarian justice, right? So it really depends a little bit too much on some really tricky metaphysical questions. And then I think it's not a great feature of a political view when it's a view in political philosophy. It so strongly depends on such contested metaphysical questions.
So, yeah, there's a lot there. A couple of things that I guess I want to comment on. The thing with Cohen and free will is sort of interesting because he never really said a lot about it. He apparently has a little thing in Rescuing Justice and Equality, I think. He says there's like a story he tells where he meets Rawls. And they talk about the free will stuff, and he's apparently not a compatibilist. He's like, yeah, me and Rawls, we're not really convinced by the arguments for compatibilism, but he never really says what he is then. I mean, is he like a libertarian? Because, I mean, I don't know. He never like endorses it, but it's like, is that what's going on in the background for Cohen? Like, I'm not really sure. So I don't know.
Yeah,
Cohen
good
on free
question. I
will
think
is,
you know more about this. So I actually don't remember this bit, but yeah, I don't actually know what his views were. Yeah, I only remember he admits that it gets you into all those tricky questions. I don't remember him resolving that or attempting to resolve it. Yeah.
yeah, he never really does, I don't think. I wanted to comment too a little bit on the caretaker thing, where there's I guess two people sort of making choices, right? The one guy is just being lazy, and then the other guy is taking care of somebody that they like, right?
Mhm.
Um, I guess I'm a little bit worried about like what is the relation what is the relational egalitarian sort of diagnosis of that problem that's going to sort of be context sensitive in a way that like could whatever response the relational egalitarian gives, maybe the luck egalitarian could just sort of take it and say the same thing, right? In terms of like how these different camps are thinking about this issue. I mean, what are they going to say about it?
Yeah. Well, that gets you sort of a little bit in the depth of my the second half of the paper, where I just give all these reasons of why distributive distribution should be responsibility sensitive according to relational egalitarianism. So not to anticipate too much, but what I do say is what really matters in terms of these choices is also what kind of relationship it then, enables the way we treat it, and what kind of expressive function or what we express in our response to the situation, right? So imagine we think, if the person just shirks off and just watches Netflix all day, compare that to the person who looks after his aunt or whatever, or his wife or his kids or something, right, or an elderly relative, and say that in the second case, like many countries do, or at least European countries do, is well, actually we should give them a carer allowance or something, right, and actually support a little bit of that, right? You might think, oh, but they chose it, how that would be in some sense, like egalitarian response, well, they chose to be in that sort of situation, and you know, we don't have to do anything about the inequality. Whereas if the relation egalitarian is, look, the kind of choice you make to support someone in need is kind of just in terms of as a sort of an expression, a very different choice than saying, okay, I'm gonna shirk off and not do anything, but I would still like to be supported, you know? So if we give them the same money, it's kind of, well, that person, it's all the money for themselves, but this other person is really supporting others. This expresses a very kind of different attitude towards other people, right? So, you know, when we support the carer, it's very different from like supporting, you know, say Petra, the money burner, you know, when it's okay, whenever she burns 90%, we give her like 50% back. She's like, no, stop, stop imposing all those costs on others, right? Whereas the case where someone like cares for an elderly relative and they gets a caring allowance, we wouldn't say like, oh, caring for someone else, you're really imposing all these horrible costs on others. How inegalitarian of you, right? So that I think is the difference, and I think that's one that I don't really see within like egalitarianism. I think they could make some other moves and say, you know, if you get ill, like if the other relative or something gets ill, right, they might experience some kind of inequality, like egalitarian inequality, and then we might find other ways to resolve that, right? So it's not the inequality between the carer and other people, but the inequality between the cared for person, and maybe indirectly supporting carers reduces that sort of inequality. I don't know, maybe that could be a response, but I think I found the relation egalitarian response or my response more direct, right? It also matters why you earn less, right?
So I guess I'm just sort of trying to figure out exactly what the idea is. So, Petra the money burner, right? If we support her, or like maybe I can sort of, maybe it would be helpful if I pointed out an example that I find clear, and maybe
Hmm.
I can sort of contrast it with this one as to why it's less clear to me. So, consider a case of sort of unilateral power, right? Like, you have sort of unilateral power over me. Obviously, that's a sort of unequal relationship, right? We're not equals in any meaningful way, right? Um, with Petra the money burner, I'm assuming she has all the same sort of like rights within her society and whatever. Um, and the idea is supposed to be that if she burns money and we still support her, she's imposing costs on us. She's treating, and we don't impose costs on her. I'm assuming, right? Is the idea that like her imposing costs on me and you and everyone else who has to support her, um, that puts her in a sort of unequal position relationally, or what? Like, what's the sort of relation you're supposed to be that we're like upset with?
Yeah, good. So that part is really about what I call not synchronic inequality, or synchronic equality, but diachronic equality, right? So what we care about is not just what the relation egalitarian should care about is not just relation inequality at any sort of at a specific point in time or something. Because then you'd say after Petra's burned the money and then she finds herself not being able to pay rent and subject to all kinds of problems. You go, like, at this point in time, there is some relational inequality or something, and then maybe she finds stigmatized because she looks like she has less money or something. Well, I say, no, we should also think about choices and positions across time, right? And then it seems a very inegalitarian attitude if Petra keeps burning the money knowing that she will get paid back, right? That just doesn't seem a very egalitarian attitude towards other people and the kind of benefits and contributions, the benefits they derive and the contributions they make to the solidaristic system, right? So here's a view, if we had like a view of relational inequality that gave no attention to personal responsibility, would say, at every given moment in time, we want relational equality. So after she burned the money, there's relational equality. Let's just give the money back or something, right? So every time they just make sure that happens, right? And I say that doesn't, over time, that seems to allow Petra, either through negligence or maybe even some nasty attitude, to treat other people who constantly have to give her the money as kind of unequals, right? She seems pretty not a nice move to make towards them, and acknowledging other people's, not acknowledging other people's contributions that they have to make for her to then burn it. And also, if that's a system, then it seems also to express a somewhat unequal attitude to the people who constantly have to subsidize this stupid behavior, right? So that's kind of the claim, right? And I understand that the case is quite different from the more standard cases of relational inequality, right? So we have, say societies where women have like legally and economically much less, a much weaker situation compared to the husband, and maybe they, like in the past, in the Netherlands or Germany as well, like they needed the permission of the husband to work and that's the income. That's the very clear case of relational inequality. Mine is much more subtle, right? But I still think we should capture intuitions here. The relational egalitarian can say, "Oh, that's such a weird case," right? I think it still triggers the case to think, okay, we need to say something about why personal responsibility matters here, right? Yeah, that's sort of the point of the case.
Right. Okay. So maybe I'm jumping ahead a little bit, and if I am, you can sort of fill in the gap a little bit. But
Mhm.
um, you go on to say in that paper that obviously it gets sort of tricky. It's not clear how much inequality this is going to allow. I guess I was sort of wondering, this was several years ago, right, that that paper came out. If you've sort of, I don't know, made any progress on that, or if you think, no, this really is just like really hard and I don't really know what to say about it still.
Yeah. Um, yeah, this paper is several years old, so I had to actually reread it today to refresh my memory a little bit. I can't say that I have really solved this, but I think my thinking has evolved in some ways, and that I've worked a bit more on this sort of instrumental disvalue of inequality, right? And to some extent, that pushed me a little bit further into like just general economic equality or like reducing, the Gini coefficient, economic inequality at the margin a bit more, right? So I have this one paper, Economic Inequality in the Long-Term Future. We're trying to argue that actually the instrumental case against economic inequality is relatively robust, independent of what kind of timeline you take. So even the short term, it's good, but also in the medium term, actually, I think there's a good case. Now, having said that, I think the instrumental case really depends on how you want to interfere in some sense in markets and set up institutions, right? There are, of course, good ways and then there are bad ways, right? So sometimes if you have bad governance, giving a carte blanche for the state to do things to try to reduce inequality might just, lead to quite bad institutions and powers that the governments get that is badly used. So it's not a carte blanche to just reduce it, but it's at the margin at least speaks to me for reducing it further just for instrumental reasons. So I think that kind of within the debate in political philosophy, sometimes we try to solve a lot by just looking at the intrinsic reasons, and think that like then by magic wouldn't we deduce then a simple criterion of, where the Gini coefficient should be or well, it should be the worst of or mix of it. Whereas I think much more a little bit about there are these sort of relational and non-instrumental concerns, and they're very important, but they're also really thick instrumental concerns, right? And I think political philosophers they say, oh yeah, the instrumental concerns, but let's move on to the more interesting intrinsic stuff. I actually think a lot is to be done also in this sort of interdisciplinary empirical question of what does it actually do with society. And there, I think I've become a little bit more egalitarian. At the same time, like conditional on there being good institutions, and I've become a bit less optimistic that it's easy to have good institutions, to bring about more equal outcomes, right, and opportunities. So but that's actually a little bit separate from from the relational egalitarianism question. Yeah, but I haven't really given the simple criterion, right? So there's also one of the criticisms of relational egalitarianism. Like egalitarianism promises simple, beautiful principle. When you see this kind of inequality, you have to compensate. That kind of inequality, you don't. Very nice and clean. And then relational egalitarians come along and say, well, actually, like 5 different things that are problematic, and we can't tell you exactly what that means about distributions, right? So that's a little bit a bit of a bug or like a downside of that view that it doesn't give a simple distributive criterion.
Yeah, that reminds me of a related issue. Because yeah, different people say different things about what we actually care about relationally. I mean, there
Mhm.
are certain things that everyone's going to agree about. Relations of domination; those are a no go. There was some. I don't remember who it was or what it was about. So that's not helpful, is it? But I remember reading. some stuff, and some relational egalitarians say some really interesting things about um, things that you never would have thought of, just sort of niche issues. I don't remember. There was one that sort of like stuck out to me when I was reading about it, and I don't remember what it was, which is not helpful. But yeah, I don't know. It's true that different relational egalitarians are going to say different things about what they've got in mind.
Yeah. And then it's also how do you balance the different issues, right? So I think there are lots of like one tricky kind of question that I think some relational egalitarians really haven't quite solved is a little bit, like quite anti-domination and huge power asymmetries, massive dependence relationships, and stigmatizing social hierarchies and so on. But at the same time, most accept, well, there are some hierarchies in organizations, say, that might be necessary because they're efficient or something. So how can we have hierarchies without those being, problematic from a relational egalitarian perspective? Or is it say that they're all problematic, but we just have to sometimes weigh, for example, efficiency versus, equality or something, say, like we could get rid of all hierarchies, but then maybe it would be less economically efficient and so on, right? I think my view tempest is a little bit because it says, if, for example, you like have preferences that are extremely like eager for income or something, right? Or you have like really preferences that are really for like for lots of free time, right? I think it doesn't express a huge relation egalitarian to think that then some level of inequality, both in terms of income, but also a little bit in terms of power, seems kind of okay, like it would be to some extent also weird if a person who just works way less, cares way less about stuff, always ends up being exactly the same in terms of power and income at all stages. That would be sort of not insufficiently attentive to the kind of different preferences people have over different goods and lifestyles and so on. So that's one aspect in which the sort of responsibility, synchronic stuff comes into these discussions as well. Yeah.
So maybe it's worth diving a little bit into anti-egalitarian positions. So that's the
Okay.
Locke versus relational egalitarians and what they're sort of on about. But there are
Mhm.
other positions. People who I don't know, maybe Nozick is a fine starting point. Think that what justice is basically a process, right? Basically, as long as you have what he calls just steps, right, from sort of point A to point B, whatever inequalities occur, he's going to accept that as basically just, right? If no injustice occurred along the way, then the end state has to be just, is basically the idea.
Yeah.
So why aren't people happy to go along with that, right? I mean, why aren't egalitarians sort of happy to go along with Nozick's sort of idea?
Yeah. Good. I think there's maybe can separate the question into like why are people not happy with a purely historical, right? He calls it historical principles of justice. Um, and why are people unhappy with Nozick's specific theory, right, of historical justice? Um, yeah. So I think, I mean, why aren't we like focusing purely on historical principles of justice? Well, I think there's several reasons, I guess. One is just that, yes, people made certain choices and that bring about certain outcomes, but it doesn't seem entirely intuitive to think, okay, then we need to completely throw out, the baby with the bathwater and ignore outcomes entirely, right? Yes, maybe someone at some point made a choice that resulted in a situation in which they now have way less than someone else. Does that mean that this is now entirely irrelevant, right? I mean, going a little bit back to the harshness objection, right? Yes, maybe someone made a certain choice and lost their income and now they live on the street and so on. But they started out from the right position, so that's all there is to it. We think, well, no, actually, we also think about what will happen in the future and how the current situation kind of matters for what's happening going forward, right? So it seems to entirely ignore the question that the present moment matters in itself, but also that future, that decision we take now and how they will affect like future outcomes always seem to matter as well intuitively. So it seems to, I think most people think, yeah, the sort of criticism that a purely pattern principle that only looks at, like here's a society, here's the matrix of who has what. Now we can tell you everything about how just it is. That is missing like a whole lot of information. I think most people are happy with that critique, but to say, okay, let's not look at all about who has what now and just focus on is the process by which they got there. Just also misses something, namely the decisions we make now might affect like how well people are doing in the future. Are they dominated? Are they happy? Unhappy? Will that screw up the political system if we have too of economic inequality and so on, right? Even if that economic inequality came about through just means, we still might care a lot about democracy, say, right? So it misses all of that. So it's way too extreme. I think that's what I would think, and maybe I'm projecting, but most political philosophers would think as well. Yeah, there's of course a lot to say about Nozick's specific theory, right? So yes, the three principles of justice: justice in acquisition, justice in transfer, and justice in rectification. I think it's called. Yeah, those are the three. And just in acquisition is, if you go back to a state where lots of stuff was unowned, that the first person who grabbed some external resources took those in a way that didn't make anyone worse off, then this was like a just original acquisition. Next, that all the stuff that at some point someone grabbed in a way that didn't make anyone worse off was transferred down through the generations in the right way, namely, without deceiving anyone, and in consent. Consent was always given and received when things were being transferred. And the third one says if either of the first two principles is not met, then we have to sort of redistribute, right? So example, ironically, if you think about distributions in the United States, and then people were quick to point out, look, the European settlers in the US, they grabbed a lot of stuff, and it's pretty obvious they didn't leave, the people already there, equally well off, right? Arguably, they, made them worse off, right? And then certainly also the way things have been passed down, it's not always been meeting Nozick's principles, to say the least, right? So there should be a lot of rectification there, and then it's of course impossible to find out what is the counterfactual in which all these injustices hadn't happened. So one thing is, of course, the principles. It's just like impossible to find out how you should compensate all the people now and so on, right? And whether it's even the right people to compensate now for the injustice in the past. And it just gets basically impossible to find out whether the current distribution is just or not, and what would be a just distribution. And there are lots of other issues. One is like, why? That's my biggest question, right? You see the three principles, and then I go, okay, why these three principles? Right? And then you need a deeper justification. And then actually Nozick is very superficial. He talks about the importance of having a meaningful life, and to guarantee the conditions under which people have a meaningful life. Their rights, they need to have rights to property, and those rights need to be really strong, like side constraints. And I just find philosophically there's a very little going on by way of justifying those principles, and a lot going on by trying to sort of like spell out the implications. There's another argument about how hypothetically it would evolve into that kind of situation of the minimal state, which you might take it or leave it. But as a philosophical justification of why we should have like these insanely strong property rights aside constraints, and that's all there is to justice, I find that like a very unsatisfying theory, right? A lot can be said. Yeah. These are some worries there, of course.
So, something that I've sort of wondered about for a while is the justice and acquisition stuff. Because there's a kind of like orthodox kind of Lockean thing, right, where you like mix your labor, and like people are sort of confused by what that means. But Nozick, I guess, is sort of his thing is like a revised sort of Lockean proviso. Like I'm not sure that he's super concerned with like labor mixing exactly. It's just like as long as you're not leaving anyone worse off, that's fine.
That's right.
The Lockean thing though about the labor mixing has always sort of interested me, because it's like it seems like a lot of people sort of get that. I don't know, like it seems like if you sort of make something, right, that should be, yours in a certain kind of way, right? Like Marx liked to point that out, right? Like the laborers are the people who are making all the things. They don't have the things. They're alienated from it. I don't know. It seems like a lot of people are sort of interested in this sort of like, if you make stuff, it's yours sort of thing. And then I've heard people say that they don't really get it. I've heard people say it's like a dog's theory of property, where like if you pee on it, it's yours. Um, I
It's a
don't
nice
really
way
know
to look
what
at
to
it.
think about the sort of mixing your labor stuff. I don't know. It's always just sort of been like one of those weird things to me that I just have no idea like what to think about it.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm the best person to talk to because I've never been particularly partial to these kinds of accounts. I mean, I have lots of different sympathies. I try to spread my credences under moral uncertainty over different theories in political philosophy, somewhat sympathetic to consequentialism, which is a very different way of looking at all of this stuff. Um, so I found it, I've not been trying very hard to construct this in the as charitably as possible. But I think Nozick's interpretation at some point, because he moves away a little bit from that simple mix your labor in it with it condition. And I think that his reasons, explicit and I think to some extent implicit, make a lot of sense to me, right? Like the dog just peeing on it, right? And let's take a more charitable case where maybe you do a lot of labor, maybe you chop down the woods and then you make some sculpture, like some wooden sculpture. But imagine if zero and you work like 10 years on it and it's just absolutely atrocious or something, right? And people hate it. It's just like, what did you do all that work for? Just taking out all the wood. We want to build, ships or whatever, right? So it kind of actually matters whether the value of your labor is what that does to other people, right? So Nozick then is much more flexible, if maybe you do a little bit of labor, but that's pretty good for other people, right? So say, I don't know, what would be a good case? Imagine there's some water, right? But there are always people come in and then they, I don't know, they throw like rubbish into the water or whatever, animals poo in it or whatever. And then you just go like you spend 2 days constructing a very nice fence around it, and all of a sudden, great water, drinking water. And people are actually very happy now. They're happy to pay a little bit to get some drinking water or maybe to swim in it or whatever the case might be. You could say, well, there was not a lot of labor, maybe it just took you a day. Whereas it's just like, well, yeah, but this is really like an important difference, right? Whereas the person who spends insane like 30 years building, constructing the worst wooden sculptures or something where everyone just goes like, what the hell did you do to a beautiful forest? So it can't be the labor itself, right? That seems to matter. It seems to be about the extrinsic value of that kind of that labor. And I think that's where Nozick is a bit more plausible than Locke. Yeah. Yeah, but the Marxist case then that's interesting. Yeah, that not sure. There definitely seems to be something else. But there, of course, also for Marx, it's the idea of exchange and use value as well, right? So it seems to also be not that you go like, we measure this person has done 3 hours at difficulty level X or whatever, whereas this person's done 5 hours at difficulty level Y. How should that, it's also a little bit about what's the value, of the product that you make. And then, if you just get less than the value that it has, then you're being exploited, right? So again, it's more about the extrinsic value rather than just labor itself, I think. That's how I would reconstruct it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. Um, that's one of those things that I'll just have to sort of sit and think about a little bit more. Because that's always
Yeah.
just that whole like issue has just been one of those things that like I sort of flip flop on. It's like some days I can sort of see where they're coming from. Like I don't know, it just seems sort of intuitive. And then other days it's like I don't get it at all. It's just one of those things that's just always flip flopped for me. I've never really sort of gotten a handle on it. I don't know. It's just one of those
Not
things.
really, yeah. But you do have the intuition, which I guess have a little bit that, like people who work a lot, I mean, that should matter for something, right? If you do that socially valuable work, that should somehow matter a little bit in a just society about what they're getting, right? And how we treat them. Particularly if it's hard work, or even bad work, right? PhD student Frauke Schmode, who wrote a very nice PhD thesis on the problem of bad work, work that needs to be done but is very unpleasant or even like dangerous or something to people, right? So the idea that working is a contribution, and people talking about productive justice, it's like a contribution to like our overall cooperative system for overall advantage. That seems very plausible to me, and I think maybe to you too. But I think what doesn't seem so plausible is the best way to capture that through thinking about some historical original acquisition or something, and then where that property gets passed down to, like the 100th cousin of the Earl of something who just, put a fence around something, thinking, okay, this person now definitely has to. I think yeah, that's why I think this can't be that little bit of labor in the original acquisition now justifies so much, stuff, property rights, like 400 years later or something.
So this gets,
Yeah, I don't know. That's why I have the intuition a little bit also that labor matters, right? And particularly hard labor, and the question whether it's socially valuable labor, of course, as well.
yeah. So I'm going to get into a whole different can of worms. Well, we'll see if it's brief. Probably not. But I've become sort of, I don't know, a little bit attuned, I guess, to other philosophers talking about, intuition talk in philosophy.
Right.
And they're sort of like suspicious of it.
Hmm.
So this is sort of like metaphilosophy. It's kind of just way different now. But, um, you can ask yourself a question like, if you have an intuition, does that make the thing you have an intuition about like more likely to be true? And it seems like not really, right? I mean, you can have an intuition about like whatever you want. Um, and then, you'll have sort of phenomenal conservatives who are like, yeah, I guess, but like you have to start somewhere, right?
Hmm.
Um, and I don't know, I'm sort of not sure what to think about the meta philosophy here because when you do philosophy, it doesn't really matter what you're doing unless it's some sort of like experimental philosophy.
Mm.
Or maybe your intuitions can be backed up by the empirics. I don't know, but just in general, I don't know. When you're doing philosophy and it's like, yeah, I just have this intuition that X, Y, or Z, I guess I'm a little bit suspicious of that. But like, I don't know. Like, why? Like, if we're basing theories of justice on intuitions, I don't know that I'm in love with that, but I also just have no idea what else to do?
Yeah. Yeah, I think I'm with you on question of intuitions. So in this paper, I do refer a little bit to intuitions, but it's just more to get I think there's also a general case for thinking that personal responsibility should matter in economic distributions, right? By the way, I also have a nice section on more abstract why it matters for all kinds of relations, right? Stosonian stuff, but setting that aside. So I think intuition sometimes can be here quick way to summarize that there are like more deeply held beliefs that play a certain role in a social context and a social relations, right? So you think, oh, personal responsibility should matter for distributions, then you have this intuition in the case, then I think you shouldn't leave it at that. You should actually inquire a bit more what are the sort of more underlying beliefs that, maybe cause or cohere with that sort of intuition, and what do those kinds of beliefs play maybe around what kind of social norms do we then have, and what kind of role do they play functionally? So I think it can be a good starting point in this kind of context, for example, this kind of paper, right? So um, I think what I'm also very critical of is this sort of use of intuition that just takes intuitions and then just runs with it and constructs principles, right? I mean, I have a lot of respect for people like Francis Cam or something who put a lot of weight on this, right? But I ultimately don't find it particularly satisfying intellectually, just, but also in terms of epistemically, I do worry that, yeah, it remains rather shallow, right? And of course, we have a whole history of intuitions having certain social contexts changing over time. Sometimes we have lots of intuitions that serve, existing interests, right? That's very easy to show about like sexist intuitions, racist intuitions. I would add, of course, with Peter Singer, speciesist intuitions, right? Could also add, for future generations, presentist intuitions, right, about why we can pollute the environment because of some intuitions around non-identity problems, or the asymmetry or something. But yeah, it's sometimes very easy to show why some people would have those intuitions and other people wouldn't, right? And it clearly, that's why I see, it's interesting to then why do those intuitions come from? In that case, sometimes you can tell some kind of critical story about why, like dominant interests or privilege people might have this kind of intuitions, right? I mean, I have lots of intuitions that are pretty, like when I think about it, it's like, oh, that's pretty helpful for myself to justify broadly the kind of life I'm having. So yeah, there are all kinds of reasons I think why we should definitely rely less on tuitions, right, than we currently do. I mean, another one is also, of course, the fact that some people's intuitions matter way more. Like I feel famous philosophers say I have an intuition, then I've observed sometimes why then people think that's much more interesting than some random person having an intuition. And if you're really an intuitionist, it's unclear why. Then of course we very often are data, if we even bother to do data collections about our intuitions, and very often we look at Western students or something that we like can easily poll in our moral philosophy class or even in X-Fi. But if you're really serious about it, then we should think, well, it's not some kind of intuition we get after having done a lot of moral philosophy or after having lived all our life in, say, liberal societies, and then we take those liberal intuitions. But we should also then obviously take a more global perspective and so on. And then it becomes much harder to do this simple intuition-based philosophy, right? So, I mean, one case, for example, in population ethics is, some people, Johann Frick or others, they start, like, oh, the asymmetry is extremely intuitive. We have the intuition that, it's bad to bring people into existence who have a life not worth living, but it's not good or more required or whatever to bring people into existence to have a great life. But then if you poll people, people don't have that intuition, right? It's actually not people do think we have some kind of moral reasons to bring happy people into existence, and it's a good thing to do, right? I have that intuition as well. But yeah, then somehow some people's intuition matters more, I guess, right? So yeah, anyway, so there's a lot going on also about deciding whose intuitions matter, and if we're then actually more rigorous and about polling more diverse set of intuitions, then I think we would also get very different results and very different philosophy. So I share your skepticism of simple intuition-based philosophy.
It gets very difficult too because, I mean, so sometimes you have intuitions that they might even be very strong, and then sometimes there might be issues that it's like, I don't know, you kind of want to push them down a little bit because when you sort of go into like rational mode, right? You just sort of sit and think for a while. You're like, maybe I should distrust this intuition. I mean, if you just sort of sit and think, about like consciousness or whatever, right? It's like maybe you think that it just seems like really sort of intuitive, maybe that, we have the physical stuff and then we have this mental stuff, right? But when I sort of sit down and I'm very careful about thinking through it, and I read, I don't know, Jack Smart or David Papineau or whatever, and they're talking about how the mental stuff just is the physical stuff. It's like I sit down and I'm very careful about thinking through, and it seems pretty plausible that maybe they're onto something here. And it's like, okay, for if I can get what I want out of this theory and I don't have to, commit myself to this extra mental stuff, that seems like the way to go. So I'm going to sort of counteract my intuition, because I think maybe there's just better ways to go. And I don't know. It just gets so like hard to deal with intuition stuff in philosophy.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think one also methodological worry I sometimes have about evoking intuitions, particularly sometimes also moral and political philosophy, of course, also evoke intuitions very strongly on describing a case, right? And then evoking certain emotions with that case, and then going, it's extremely unjust that this would happen to that person or something, right? I sometimes thinking this can also move us a little bit away from what you call, the rational mode, right? For example, in psychology, we do sort of know that people, put much more like emphasis on identified victims rather than statistical victims, right? They also, when they asked, when I asked about like how to distribute charitable donations, sometimes they would more moved if they get like a detailed description of one case than if they said, actually, with that donation, you can save an expectation 4.7 people rather than one, right? They would go for the one where they had the detailed description. And, I think if it's, for example, in the space of moral and political philosophy, then these sort of detailed cases, intuitions, I think can also move us a little bit into that sort into some areas of that are like we might describe as cognitive biases and a way out of rational mode. And another, I think, mechanism that just came to my mind is also sometimes when you ask people about hypotheses, they're going to do some research and go, what do you think is going to happen? What's your hypothesis? Which is standard practice sometimes in science, of course, but I think some people worry that this then also actually biases you to thinking, okay, this is what I expect to see, so I kind of also now want to find it a little bit, right? So yeah, and that might be similar if you start off by first just writing down all your intuitions and then you start the research and go like you maybe looking for arguments that align there. Yeah. I mean, at the same time, philosophy is of course wonderful when you start up with like things that seem pretty intuitive, like premises or whatever, or that seem foundational in some ways, and you end up in a crazy place or something, right? I find that sometimes some of the joys of philosophy, right? But of course, like intuitions can sometimes be a sanity check. I feel like that. That I don't know how much weight to give this if you're like a super rational Bayesian, but you have maybe some prior that this has some weight or something as evidence, right? That you maybe some of the premises are not right, or maybe the entire the inferences aren't valid for some reason because it leads you to some place. So that could also not be entirely rational to think, you're that you have some role to play there. Also in political philosophy, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting the
I don't know if
basic.
you share that view, if you think, well, actually, from what you said, it sounded a little bit like, oh, let's just go entirely for the rational mode, and then just sort of, and the argument focused or foundational arguments, and ignore the intuitions.
Yeah, I'm not sure, right? It's one of those things that I'm very suspicious about intuition talk. Like if I don't know, if your sort of ultimate sort of thing when it bottoms out is like, I don't know, I just have an intuition that X. I don't love that. The problem is that
Yeah,
I don't know what else to do, right? Like we're kind of just stuck there. Um, I'm not sure. I don't know because maybe that's not right either. Because like I have an intuition that like lots of us have an intuition that like there's mental stuff that's like different from the physical stuff. But I sort of beat that back when I think very carefully about it. So maybe that's not right. Maybe we're not stuck. I don't know. It's one of those things though that I don't know, right? I don't have like a sort of fleshed out
yeah,
view. I just think it's complicated and I don't know.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, it is complicated. I would say a little bit about to bring it back a little bit. My philosophy of mind, unfortunately, is not really where my strength lies in cognitive
Sure.
science and so on. So maybe bring it back to moral and political philosophy. There, are, of course, frameworks like Rawls has famously talks about reflective equilibrium, where we have what he calls considered moral judgments, which are kind of like intuitions, but not all the intuitions. Right? So if you're like super angry, and then you go, now I have the intuition that everyone who's ever crossed me needs to be beaten up or something, you go, well, that's not a great, not great input epistemically speaking. So it should be a little bit more rational. So not necessarily always this thing that first pops up, but also not necessarily not a theory-based judgment either. So considered moral judgment. But then we also have fundamental kind of beliefs, for example, we should somehow care about impartiality or equality or whatever. And then we also, I would add fundamental, like maybe epistemic constraints and logical constraints about consistency or something, right? And then the third one, the most really important one, is of course also empirical theory and data, right? And then you need to bring all of that together, and then actually some of those intuitions or considered moral judgment also need to be thrown out at some point, right? If you find actually once you know all the data about the world, this just makes no sense. Or once you've actually thought about how to come up with a coherent set of your most fundamental beliefs and make those consistent with empirical data, the fundamental moral beliefs also mean you have to throw out the intuitions, right? So, for example, say in animal ethics, once you sort of looked enough about the differences between species around like the probability that they might have like pleasure and pain and suffering, all that kind of stuff. Once you've really thought about how can we make fundamental views and ethics kind of consistent, then it seems kind of weird to say, oh, I really care about suffering among humans, but then we draw the distinction at species, and then people say, okay, how can we fundamentally justify that? And of course, stuff about rationality, and then you get all kinds of arguments. And then, if you agree with me, then at some point you end up with a view where you go, okay, actually, our species' intuitions that we started with they just have to be thrown out, right? There's no way to make our fundamental moral beliefs consistent. And all this empirical data that we have, or the fundamental theories in biology, they also don't really chime, right? So you can start with some intuitions, but you have to be really open in the process of engaging with fundamental moral theory and empirical work to be throwing it out at the end. So that's one way, the sort of reflective equilibrium theory. Yeah, I mean, my own view, if you want to know, is that I actually think we should do reflective equilibrium, but we should also do some intuitionist style philosophy. We should also do some foundational, like, it's the difference very often between foundationalism and coherentism, and in moral philosophy you have the similar foundationalism and reflective equilibrium. Reflective equilibrium being roughly what coherentism is in epistemology. But then I think we should be the sort of morally uncertain about all of these different research programs and give some credence to all of them. So if I leave it around moral uncertainty, then I think, we should give actually very little weight to intuitions, somewhat sympathetic to consequentialism, which actually gives much less weight to intuitions than, Rawls, and obviously much less than intuitionists and most deontologists. So that's kind of my first order favorite style of theorizing. But sometimes if I stay back, I can see, okay, there's some reason to be intuitionist style deontologist, and there's some reason to be a reflective equilibrium style Rawlsian or something. That's how I think a little bit about it. So that also means that if you're morally uncertain, there's not one correct way to deal with intuitions. So a very long, somewhat complicated answer, but I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, sounds like you want to go for a sort of pluralist kind of way of
Yeah.
Is it like,
Although I still would say my credence, whatever the intuitionists come up with, I think, Mike Hume, I think, or Francis Camp to some extent, I don't give zero credence to what they say as a result of the intuitionist arguments, but my credence is much lower than if there's a well-constructed, beautiful consequentialist argument, or even like a Rawlsian style argument. I still have higher credences in those than I have in the purely intuitionist, but it's not zero credence.
Yeah. 9:40. Well, I'll tell you what, I wouldn't mind giving you a little bit of a buffer zone, just to, I don't know, collect your things or do something before you have to go. So I'm happy to sort of leave it on this note about metaphilosophy if you want to take a few minutes for yourself before you got to go do stuff.
Yeah, sure. I think maybe I could add just one comment about the first half of the paper that we haven't spoken about. I think well, the sort of more moral philosophy people and responsibility, people interested in moral responsibility and moral philosophy. I think one argument I would like to sort of also highlight the relation egalitarian can make connects it with sort of Straussonian pragmatic theories of moral responsibility, right? So I earlier mentioned that I think it's a problem that like egalitarians have to rely on something so metaphysical, like there has to be a metaphysically correct answer to that response, at least to the problem of free will, or at least people like Cohen have to. Now say, look, if you take at least a descriptive, pragmatic view of what responsibility ascriptions and practices have, you can account for that quite well, then seeing why relation egalitarians would think those actually have some importance, and we should continue at least some of those, not all of those, but some of those, right? So Strawson famously makes a distinction between the participant stance and the objective stance, right? So when the participant stance, we participate in interpersonal relationships, we sometimes, blame people when, our friends have, we're bad-mouthing behind our back. It would be weird to just go like, completely detached from that and not think they should have any responsibility for that, right? And maybe to even blame them a little bit, right? Confront them and so on. So from within relationships, it makes a lot of sense, right? And lots of people also argue, I include myself there, that some disposition to respond with reactive attitudes is actually necessary for certain relationships, right? So the normative expectations, for example, I have towards my friend, that she doesn't badmouth me behind my back or steals my property or whatever, right? I have those normative expectations towards her. And if then she does those things, it'd be kind of weird if I weren't at all disposed to say, well, I'm disappointed already, like, what the hell, right? So that's the first argument, that some responsibility ascriptions and responses are required to uphold certain kind of relationships. And given that the relational egalitarian shifts the focus to those relations, they of course say, yeah, that's why we need personal responsibility. Otherwise, we can't really have all those meaningful relationships that we think are valuable. And the second point is they can then make a finer argument as well. Within those relationships, it's also important not to like go towards the objective stance too easily, right? Sometimes we have to. So for Strauss, the objective stance is something like if some people behave a certain way, could either go like and have some response to that, like a reactive attitude, like resentment or concern and thing, or like blame and stuff, or praise, right? Or we could just go like, interesting, like maybe I could manipulate or get them to maneuver in that direction or something. I just see them as like not as humans who are worthy, where I like think it's appropriate to respond to them in certain emotional and also cognitive ways, but it's just something like an object to be manipulated into certain direction, right? And that's what he calls the objective stance. I think relation egalitarians want to say, well, that's not a great way to relate to other people, right? So if the government, well, let's start with interpersonal stuff. If I just view my partner that way and go like, oh, I know whenever she does something wrong, if I do some kind of behavioralist tricks on her where, I ring a bell, I know this will like trigger some idea and then she will do the other thing that I want to. And, that's how I change her behavior when I think her behavior is not up to scratch. That's sort of a very weird way of relating. I don't really see her as a full adult that's worthy of engaging with and providing reasons and even providing emotional responses and so on too, right? That doesn't seem a very egalitarian attitude towards my partner, right? You might think, okay, that works for interpersonal relations. What about the political level? To some extent, I think that also holds before, for example, for this relationship between citizens, right? So if the only way in which we relate as citizens is to just sort of manipulate each other on social media or something, right? Rather than think, okay, you're grown adults, I'll provide reasons. And if you like say horrible stuff, I'm disappointed. And I might also voice that disappointment. But just only think, oh, maybe if I just adjust the algorithm, I'll just nudge you into the right direction. Just the way I would, with a toddler or something, right? That doesn't seem a very disrespectful egalitarian attitude to hold between citizens. And the same could be said also for the state, right? If the state tries to just get people to act in certain ways and treats them like children and thinks they're never like worthy of being seen as responsible adults who also sometimes have to carry the consequences of their actions and so on, right? That is also not a very egalitarian way to treat them. So I just wanted to add there is this sort of second half of the paper, which is much more about economic distributions and stuff, and that you have to visit consequences on people for their choices sometimes. But I think there's even a fundamental level where, in the very nature of having egalitarian relationships, we sometimes have to treat other people as responsible agents, right? Otherwise, we can't really have these very valuable egalitarian relationships.